The silence of Blackwood Manor was not the absence of sound, but the heavy, velvet hush of generations of undisturbed dust. It swallowed every noise, making the scrape of Elias Vance's worn canvas shoe against the aged oak floorboards seem like a rupture in the fabric of time. 11 years old, small for his age, but possessed of an immense, rigid purpose. Elias had dedicated the past 2 weeks to this impossible task. He was cleaning a mansion that had been abandoned for half a century, and he was doing it for free. He did not possess the luxury of questioning the logic of his efforts. The logic was simple, carved deep into the hollow space where fear usually resided. A clean space was a place of worth, and a place of worth was a place where one might finally be allowed to stay. The air in the grand hallway was thick, particulate, and carried the specific sickly sweet scent of advanced decay, a mix of dry rot, forgotten mothballs, and the brittle, papery smell of oxidized newsprint. It coated the inside of his nostrils, settling in his throat like fine sand, a constant, abrasive reminder of the scale of the reclamation project. Elias was currently engaged in the ground-floor study, a room designed for scholarship and solitude, now a monument to neglect. Daylight struggled to penetrate the high, leaded windows, each pane obscured by a thick beige film of accumulated grime and the tenacious webs spun by long-dead spiders. The weak, diffused light rendered everything in muted sepia tones. He moved methodically, a small boy in oversized work gloves that bunched awkwardly at his knuckles. His current focus was the monumental hearth, choked not with soot, but with an overflow of discarded paper, letters, invoices, architectural sketches, all brittle and yellowed, dumped there apparently in a single, frenzied cleaning effort decades ago, and then promptly forgotten. Elias did not simply sweep. He catalogued, sorting the materials with a quiet reverence for the past they represented. Each sheet was carefully lifted, shaken gently to release the clinging dust, and stacked into separate, manageable piles, one for documents too fragile to handle, one for general refuse, and one for potential keepsakes, though what he would keep or why, he wasn't sure. It was a compulsion born of necessity. Nothing could be dismissed. He worked through the late afternoon, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic, heavy sigh of the old house settling under the changing air pressure and the soft, dry rustle of paper. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, mingling with the dust to form a thin line of muddy grime. He ignored the stinging sensation, his focus absolute. He reached the deepest cavity of the hearth, a dark, recessed space where the refuse had been packed hardest. Here, the air was particularly stagnant, heavy with the scent of coal dust and ancient soot. He scraped the last resistant layers using a small, stiff-bristled utility brush he had found in the abandoned servants' pantry. The scraping sound was distinct, not the soft shh of dust on stone, but a sharp, metallic tsk. Elias paused, his small hand freezing mid-motion. His breath caught, held tight in his chest. His heart, which had been beating the slow, steady rhythm of physical exertion, now accelerated, a sudden, rapid flutter of confused adrenaline. He had learned early that in abandoned places, sharp metallic sounds meant trouble, usually structural failure, or sometimes the skittering of creatures far less concerned with his presence than he was with theirs. He knelt fully on the cold marble surround, peering into the gloom. He held the brush steady, using the light filtering from the window behind him to illuminate the small cavity. The object was lodged tight against the side wall of the chimney flue, covered in a thick, uniform coating of black soot and plaster dust. It was indistinct in shape at first, merely a resistant, heavy mass. He reached in with his gloved hand, the rough canvas absorbing the dry dirt. His fingers closed around something dense and irregularly shaped. It was heavier than he expected for debris. He pulled, exerting a steady, increasing force. The object refused to budge, trapped by decades of compacted refuse and mineralized dust. Elias shifted his weight, pressing his shoulder against the marble mantelpiece, giving himself better leverage. He pulled again, harder this time, the tendons in his small wrist straining beneath the taut skin. With a grinding thunk, the object gave way, tearing free from the compacted trash. A cloud of fine, choking dust erupted instantly, filling the air around his face. Elias coughed, a dry, rattling sound that vibrated painfully in his chest. He pulled his forearm across his eyes, trying to clear his vision. When the dust settled slightly, he looked down at his hands. He was holding a small metallic box. It was roughly the size and shape of an old shoebox, but much heavier. It was made of dull, dark grey metal, possibly iron or heavy steel, though its composition was masked by the thick layer of filth. The metal was pitted and scored, bearing the hallmarks of time and rough handling. It wasn't just dusty, it was entombed. Stuck to the sides were remnants of what looked like heavy, decaying oilcloth, dark brown and stiff, suggesting it had been wrapped and deliberately concealed before being thrown into the refuse pile, perhaps years before the house was fully shuttered. The metal felt cold, aggressively cold, radiating a deep chill even through the thick canvas of his gloves. Elias gently placed the box on the edge of the hearth. He peeled off his right glove, the sensation of the rough wool lining momentarily irritating his damp skin. He reached out and touched the box directly. It was heavier than any ordinary piece of trash. This weight was not accidental. It felt intentional, solid. He ran his fingertip across the lid, wiping away a patch of the black powder. Beneath the grime, the metal was dark and uniform, devoid of any decoration or stamping, except for a large, heavy latch mechanism set into the front edge. The latch was locked. A sudden, sharp awareness shot through him, banishing the fatigue of the long afternoon. This was not just debris. Refuse did not have industrial-grade locked latches. Trash did not have this specific, dense gravity. Elias looked around the opulent, decaying room. Why would someone throw a locked, heavy metal box into the fireplace? It defied the casual nature of the surrounding papers. This was hidden within the trash, not simply placed atop it. His emotional state shifted instantly from the focused, steady determination of a worker to the coiled, tight anxiety of a small creature sensing a profound change in its environment. His mind raced, not in words, but in a surge of potent, fearful questions. What is it? Did someone forget it? Is it valuable? The last question was the most dangerous, carrying the weight of his entire current existence. If it was valuable, it was dangerous. If it was valuable, it might belong to someone else who cared enough to claim it, and claiming it meant potentially revoking his unspoken, tenuous claim on this space, this sanctuary. He pushed the thought aside, the sheer urgency of the discovery overriding the paralyzing fear. He needed to examine the box. He retrieved a slightly damp cloth from his cleaning bucket, a relic of his painstaking work on the mantelpiece veneer, and began to wipe the box down. He worked slowly, meticulously, removing the layers of soot that had protected the metal for decades. As the layers came off, the true nature of the container emerged. It was not iron, but polished steel, once perhaps gleaming silver, now oxidized to a deep charcoal hue. The hinges were thick and solid, riveted into the back. The locking mechanism was not a simple snap, but an intricate, heavy-duty latch requiring a specific key. He tipped the box. It made no sound. Whatever was inside was either packed tightly or was a single, heavy object that filled the entire volume. He spent the next 15 minutes systematically searching the immediate vicinity of the hearth. He sifted through the remaining pile of refuse, feeling every scrap of paper, every shard of plaster, every gritty clump of coal dust. He was looking for a key, or anything that might explain the box's presence. His fingers, bare now on his right hand, grew numb from the cold dust and the sustained focus. The only thing he found were two small corroded brass tacks, a fragment of glass, and a large, oddly shaped chunk of hardened wax that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. No key. Elias sat back on his heels, the box resting heavily between his knees. The urgency intensified, twisting his stomach into a knot. This was not just trash. This was something. He ran his finger along the seam where the lid met the body of the box. There was no visible way to pry it open without serious force. Force he did not possess, and tools he did not have. His entire inventory consisted of the utility brush, the bucket, the rags, and a worn-out flathead screwdriver he used to scrape paint splatter from the trim. He picked up the screwdriver. It was too flimsy, its tip already bent slightly from previous skirmishes with stubborn grime. He held the box in his lap and carefully inserted the tip into the narrowest gap near the latch. He applied the slightest pressure. The screwdriver tip bent further with an immediate sickening squeal of protesting metal. He withdrew it instantly, the small sound echoing loudly in the immense silence of the room. He could not risk destroying the only tool he had, or damaging the box further. The solution had to be external. The key had to be near. Who throws away a locked box but keeps the key nearby, perhaps accidentally? He returned to the pile of refuse he had already sorted, the paper pile. It was perhaps 4 feet high, comprising hundreds of disparate documents. He had to go through it again, not looking for historical value, but for something small, sharp, and metallic. The light outside was beginning to fail, the sepia tones deepening into a charcoal grey. The change in light always brought a cold rush of anxiety to Elias. The approaching night made the manor feel vast, unforgiving, and much less empty. He reached for the pile of brittle, aging documents. He started with the letters, which were bound by faded silk ribbon. He carefully untied one bundle. The letters, written in looping, elegant cursive, crumbled slightly at the edges under his touch. He unfolded one, holding it up to the weak light. He wasn't trying to read the content, only searching for anything small tucked inside the folds, perhaps affixed with dried sealing wax. The paper felt like dried autumn leaves, crisp, fragile, ready to disintegrate into dust at the slightest wrong pressure. He handled each sheet with a meticulous slowness that stretched the passage of time into a thick, syrup-like viscosity. The sound of the paper was the only sound now, a continuous, delicate, dry shush and crackle. Minutes bled into half an hour. His eyes burned from staring intently into the gloom, straining to distinguish the subtle sheen of metal from the dull matte of the aged paper. His fingers were stiff with cold and fatigue. He moved to the next category of refuse, the invoices and receipts. These were stiffer, thicker documents, easier to handle but often folded into complex, tight squares. He uncreased them with the agonizing slowness demanded by their fragility. He found nothing, only the dry record of transactions long concluded, names he didn't recognize, and dates from the early 1960s. Frustration began to curl into a tight ball in his chest, hot and sharp, threatening to boil over into a panic that would ruin his careful work. He hated this feeling, the loss of control, the sudden leap from purposeful work to desperate hunting. He reminded himself of the stakes. He was cleaning for sanctuary. This box, whatever it contained, represented a profound interruption to that sanctuary, an urgent question mark placed in the middle of his careful plan. If he could not open it, he could not determine its true value or its risk. He moved to the last pile, the architectural sketches. These were large, heavy sheets, rolled tightly and tied with twine. He untied the first roll. It sprung open with a sighing sound, revealing meticulous blueprints of the manor itself, floor plans drawn in black ink on thick vellum. He carefully flattened the first large sheet on the floor. It depicted the ground floor study he was in, complete with minute detailing of the hearth and mantelpiece. As he ran his hand over the aged vellum, Smoothing out the roll marks, his fingers brushed against a small, distinct irregularity in the thick paper near the center fold. It felt rigid, not like a fold or crease, but an object secured within the paper. A renewed surge of adrenaline hit him, colder and more intense than before. This was not fear. This was the sudden, sharp alert that comes just before a vital discovery. He held the blueprint carefully up to the diminishing light, tilting it, searching for the anomaly. Near the center fold, where the paper was thickest, he saw a slight bulge masked by the density of the vellum. It seemed to have been deliberately placed there and then secured by some adhesive that had since dried and flaked away, leaving only the shadow of its presence. Elias swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat making the action painful. He felt his pulse drumming loudly in his ears, overwhelming the distant sounds of the house. He used the tip of the utility brush to gently pry open the central fold. The vellum resisted, crackling ominously. He stopped, switching tactics. He didn't want to rip this piece of history or the potential clue it held. He used his thumbnail, pressing down slowly and precisely along the crease, easing the old fibers apart. It took 3 excruciating minutes of minimal pressure, inch by agonizing inch, until the paper finally separated just enough to reveal the object trapped inside. It was small, about 2 inches long, and slender. It was made of dull, dark metal, tarnished but recognizable. It was a key. Not a large, elaborate skeletal key, but a compact, sturdy cylinder of dark bronze, its edges smoothed by years of handling or friction, its intricate wardings pointing downward into the paper fold. Elias's hand trembled visibly as he reached in and gently extracted it. It fell onto the vellum with a tiny, sharp tick, a sound that, in the cavernous silence, felt like a thunderclap. He picked it up. It was heavy for its size, cold and dense. The head of the key was a simple loop, easy to grasp. The metallic scent of oxidation and old oil immediately transferred to his skin. He held the key in his left hand and the heavy metal box in his right. He looked from one to the other, a profound sense of urgency now overriding all other emotions. He knew instinctively that this combination was not accidental. The placement of the key, hidden within the structural plans of the very room where the box was discarded, suggested a final, deliberate act of concealment. Elias moved back to the hearth. He placed the box on the mantelpiece, eye level. He held the key steady. The lock mechanism was located centrally on the face of the box. The keyhole was a precise, tight slit. He inserted the key slowly. The wardings scraped against the metal interior of the lock with a faint, dry tsh. It went in smoothly, fitting the aperture with an unnerving precision. He paused, his hand hovering over the key. The air felt suffocatingly heavy. This was the moment. Opening this box represented not just finding an object, but confronting the hidden history of Blackwood Manor, the history that might determine whether he belonged here or not. His breath hitched. He closed his eyes momentarily, gathering the immense, fragile courage needed for this simple, final action. He twisted the key. The mechanism was old, stiff, and utterly silent. There was no satisfying click or loud thunk. Instead, there was a feeling of tremendous internal resistance, a grating of old metal parts moving against decades of internal corrosion. He leaned into the twist, his small fingers tightening their grip on the key head until his knuckles shone white against the grimy skin. He pushed his full body weight into the movement. Suddenly, with a muted, deep chunk, the lock released. He immediately pulled the key back out. It slid free, hot where his fingers had gripped it, leaving a faint oil residue on the pad of his thumb. The latch was now loose. He could feel the slight give in the mechanism. Elias did not hesitate now. The fear was replaced by a taut, overriding necessity. He reached for the lid of the box, placing his fingertips on the cold, hard edge. He lifted, The hinges groaned softly in protest, a long, drawn-out, agonizing sound of tortured metal. The lid was heavier than expected, weighted, and the movement was slow, deliberate. As the lid rose, a pocket of trapped air escaped, carrying a powerful, distinct scent that hit Elias with an immediate, overwhelming force. It wasn't the smell of decay or dust. It was the sharp, clean, metallic scent of copper, combined with the faint, sweet perfume of very old, dried roses, and something else. The musky, unmistakable aroma of aged, tanned leather. He pulled the lid all the way back. It stopped, resting against the back of the box with a solid clank. Elias stared down into the interior. The box was lined with a dark, heavy velvet, faded to burgundy, now crushed and flattened by the contents. The lighting was poor, but the texture of what was inside was instantly clear. The inheritance was not a jewel, not a stack of cash, and not a crown. It was composed of 3 items, arranged meticulously side by side, filling the space exactly. The first item, sitting nearest the hinge, was a ledger. Not a formal bound book, but a thick journal, perhaps 10 inches by 8, bound in scarred, deeply cracked brown leather. It was secured shut by a thin, looping string, tied in a knot that looked too delicate to have lasted this long. The second item, placed centrally, was a photograph. It was large and faded, curling slightly at the edges. It was an image of a man and a woman standing stiffly on the front steps of Blackwood Manor. They looked formal, severe, yet their hands were linked tightly between them. The man wore an antiquated dark suit, his face thin and angular, his eyes startlingly pale even in the monochrome image. The woman was dressed in a high-necked gown, her hair pulled back severely. They were young but looked weighted by responsibility. Elias recognized the steps. He had scrubbed those same marble stairs yesterday morning. The third item, tucked tightly into the last space, was a small, heavy packet wrapped in thin white tissue paper. It had the distinct shape and thickness of legal documents. Elias reached for the photograph first. He lifted it out gently. The paper was stiff and cold. As he rotated it to catch the last rays of the fading light, he noticed the back. It was blank, save for a single small inscription, written in the same looping script he had seen in the study's discarded letters. To our heir with all that remains, June 1963, June 1963. The date aligned perfectly with the documents in the hearth, the final closing of the house. Elias felt a slow, terrifying recognition dawn in his mind. Heir. The word resonated with an impossible, staggering weight. He had not been merely cleaning an abandoned house, he had been entering a legacy. His fingers tightened around the edges of the photograph. The urgency he had felt earlier now transformed into a paralyzing sense of gravity, of consequence that was too immense for an 11-year-old boy to bear. This discovery was not a reward. It was a mandate. He placed the photograph carefully back in the box and reached for the leather-bound ledger. It was cold to the touch, heavy with the weight of its pages. The leather was deeply worn, the edges smoothed where fingers had repeatedly rested. He carefully untied the thin string. It fell loose with a gentle plink. He opened the ledger. The first page was not an entry, but a formal declaration, written entirely in the same beautiful, severe cursive, executed in thick black ink that had faded to a deep sepia. He had to squint, holding the book up close to his face, struggling to decipher the dense handwriting in the growing darkness. This journal serves as the final, detailed accounting of the Blackwood estate. It is written for our heir, whose identity we cannot know at this juncture, save for the fact that they will possess the courage and necessity to reclaim what has been lost. To whoever finds this, know that the estate was not abandoned out of carelessness, but out of necessity and profound despair. The wealth was stolen, not by external enemies, but by the relentless, grinding bureaucracy of debt and misappropriation following the Great Panic of the previous decade. We fought and failed. All that remains is the house itself, tied up in legal mechanisms meant to deter immediate sale by creditors until a specific condition could be met. That condition is documented within these pages. We entrust this final record to the place we loved most. The fireplace of the study, hidden among the refuse we were forced to leave behind, where we believed only someone truly dedicated to clearing the past would ever look. If you hold this book, you have demonstrated that dedication. You have earned the right to know what you possess. A.G. Blackwood, June 1963. Elias lowered the book, his hands trembling violently now. The names were meaningless to him, but the message was not. Necessity, reclaim, dedicated. He, Elias Vance, the small, desperate boy cleaning the grime for a chance at a corner to sleep, was the fulfillment of that prophecy. He had cleaned the mansion out of necessity. He had found the trash out of dedication. The urgency returned but sharpened now by understanding. The consequences were no longer vague. They were specific and legal. He flipped several pages forward in the journal, seeking the condition mentioned. The subsequent pages were filled with tedious, meticulous listings of assets sold, debts incurred, and dates of legal filings, a crushing narrative of financial ruin. Elias skipped past the endless columns of numbers, his heart hammering against his ribs, seeking the narrative context. He found it near the back, under a heavy header. The contingency. Elias stopped breathing entirely. Vance. His own name. Elias Vance. He read the entry, his eyes scanning the dense ink, focusing fiercely through the wave of sheer, impossible disbelief that threatened to drown him. The last standing legal avenue we had to preserve Blackwood Manor was to establish an unbreakable trust, specifically engineered to exploit a loophole in property law regarding long-term, unacknowledged familial debt. The key requirement for triggering the trust's dissolution and transferring ownership free and clear is this. The property must remain abandoned and legally unclaimed for 50 years, surviving the statute of limitations for the specific debts incurred. Upon the conclusion of the 50th year, the estate transfers ownership entirely to the last surviving relative of Agnes and Gideon Blackwood, whose middle name is Vance, provided they have performed a demonstrable act of stewardship on the property in the year immediately prior to the trust's expiration. This was our desperate gamble. The statute expires in September of 2013. If you are reading this and your name is Vance, you are that heir. The trust expires in 3 months. You must prove stewardship. Elias felt the floor tilt beneath him. September 2013. This was June 2013. He stumbled back from the hearth, knocking his cleaning bucket with a loud, hollow clang that echoed through the study and into the silent halls. The water sloshed out, making a dark, spreading stain on the dusty oak. The metallic taste of fear filled his mouth. He wasn't just cleaning for belonging, he was cleaning for ownership, and the deadline was terrifyingly immediate. He was Elias Vance. His middle name, given to him by the grandmother he barely remembered, was Vance. The weight of the last 2 weeks of relentless, grueling labor, the scrubbing, the sweeping, the hauling of debris, was suddenly transmuted from a personal penance into a crucial, life-altering legal requirement, demonstrable act of stewardship. Elias looked at his hands, grime-stained and calloused, proof enough of his stewardship. He had done the work. Unknowingly, blindly, driven only by a desperate need for a safe place, he had fulfilled the central, impossible requirement of the trust. But the fear was immediate and urgent. If the trust expired in 3 months and he was the heir, the outside world, lawyers, creditors, the city council who viewed the manor as a tax liability would soon be aware. He needed to understand the final package, the legal documents. He reached back into the box, his movements jerky, Driven by the urgency of the ticking clock he could now hear in his head, he pulled out the thin packet wrapped in tissue paper. He tore the tissue paper away, not bothering with delicacy. Inside, there were 3 sheets of stiff folded parchment, official and heavy, covered in stamps and seals. He unfolded the top document. It was titled, in severe Gothic script, Declaration of Trust Termination Conditions. The document was complex, filled with incomprehensible legal jargon, but Elias scanned it until he found the core requirement, repeating the text from the journal, and then adding a crucial detail. The act of stewardship must be documented and filed with the Municipal Records Office no later than 30 days following the expiration of the statute of limitations. Failure to file evidence of stewardship by the stipulated date renders the trust null and void, and the property reverts to the city. It was now late June. He had 3 months of work left and 30 days to prove it. The crushing gravity of the situation hit him fully. He wasn't just cleaning a house, he was engaging in a silent, solitary race against time and bureaucracy. His work, which he had assumed was invisible and thankless, was in fact the only thing standing between him and being thrown back onto the street. The consequences of failure were devastating and immediate. Lose the house, lose the sanctuary, and return to the terrifying uncertainty of the outside world he had worked so hard to escape. He had to document his efforts. How did one prove weeks of solitary labor in a manner acceptable to a municipal records office? Elias looked around the study. He saw the huge piles of carefully sorted refuse. He saw the gleam of the marble hearth he had scrubbed to a dull luster. He saw the water stain from his spilled bucket, ironically marking the spot of his momentous discovery. He needed proof of the before and the after. He quickly searched the box again. Nothing else inside but the velvet lining. No camera, no witnesses, no instructions for documentation. Agnes and Gideon Blackwood had only provided the condition, not the method of proof. He was alone in this. Elias clutched the journal and the legal documents tightly to his chest. The cold metal box lay open on the mantelpiece, a stark symbol of his new, terrifying reality. He had to devise a plan, and he had to execute it immediately, before the outside world, the world that would soon discover the imminent transfer of Blackwood Manor, came looking for the heir. He moved swiftly, the fatigue of the long day momentarily suspended by the powerful electric charge of urgency coursing through his body. He needed light. He found 3 half-burnt thick ivory candles in a dusty cabinet drawer in the dining room, along with a box of old matches. He lit them, the sudden flickering warmth pushing back the encroaching shadows. The candlelight cast massive, dancing caricatures of his own small figure on the walls of the study, amplifying the room's intimidating scale. He sat down on the floor again, the leather journal open to the last page, the page dedicated to final instructions. Documentation. He needed a visual record. He didn't own a camera. He barely owned the clothes on his back. He certainly couldn't leave the manor to buy one. That would mean exposing himself and possibly attracting the wrong kind of attention. He inventoried his meager possessions again, searching for an alternative. The flathead screwdriver, the rags, the brush, the bucket, and now the box, the key, the journal, and the legal packet. He focused on the key. It was solid bronze, dense. It had a sharp, intricate shape. He looked around the room, desperately seeking a solution. His eyes fell on a pile of materials he had set aside, a stack of thin, pliable sheets of lead flashing he had scraped off a leaky windowsill earlier in the week. He had kept them simply because metal was too valuable to throw away. A desperate, fragile idea took root. He retrieved a sheet of the lead, about a foot square. It was dull grey, soft, and malleable. If he couldn't take photographs, he could create a physical, undeniable record of the keys to the estate, the key to the inheritance box itself, and the primary key to the front door. which he possessed and always kept hidden under a loose floorboard in the foyer. This would be his proof of possessory right and access, a symbolic document tied irrevocably to the discovery and the identity of the heir. He started with the inheritance key. He laid the sheet of lead flat on the smooth marble. He centered the key on the lead, stabilizing it with his left hand. Using the dull, broad side of the screwdriver handle, he began to press down, slowly and evenly, transferring the exact shape of the key into the soft lead. This was not a quick process. Lead was soft, but the detail needed was immense. He had to apply persistent, targeted pressure, working his way around the outline of the key, feeling the slight give of the metal under his tool. The surface of the lead began to warp slightly under the sustained pressure. The work demanded incredible focus and precision. If he pressed too hard, the soft metal would tear. If he pressed too lightly, the crucial details of the key's warding would be lost. He worked for 20 minutes, the rhythmic sound of the handle tapping against the lead sheet, a low, steady thump, thump, thump in the silent study. The candlelight flickered, casting nervous shadows that danced with his movements. When he finally lifted the bronze key, the depression left in the lead was perfect, a precise, three-dimensional negative image of the key. The smallest details of the grooves and teeth were etched into the soft grey metal. He labelled this impression directly onto the lead with the tip of the screwdriver. Box, key, found, study, hearth. He moved on to the second piece of proof, the manor key. He retrieved the massive, ornate iron key to the front door from its hiding place. It was cold, heavy and complex, nearly 8 inches long, a medieval-looking object that felt like the true physical heart of the house. This impression would be much harder. The key was larger, and the metal was irregular and pitted. He positioned the iron key on a fresh section of the lead sheet and began the arduous process of pressing the imprint. The sheer bulk of the key required tremendous leverage. Elias gritted his teeth, leaning into the task with the full weight of his small body. He focused entirely on the texture of the metal yielding beneath him, ignoring the burning ache in his shoulders and wrists. The urgency of the trust, the fear of the deadline, and the sheer impossibility of the situation fueled his concentration. This act of creating the physical evidence was itself a profound act of stewardship, a testament to his isolation and resourcefulness. He was using the very refuse of the house to authenticate his claim. After another grueling half-hour, the imprint was finished. The lead was slightly stretched, but the impression was undeniable, the perfect, ghostly shape of the manor key. He etched the label, manor key, possessory access. Elias sat back, exhausted, staring at the lead sheet. This was his proof, a physical, non-replicable piece of evidence that tied him, the anonymous heir, directly to the most critical physical objects of the estate, objects that could only be accessed by someone who had been inside, cleaning and uncovering secrets. He needed to store this evidence, along with the journal and the legal documents, in a place of safety. The heavy steel box, his inheritance casket, was the perfect vessel. He gathered the parchment, the journal, and the lead sheet. He carefully folded the lead sheet over itself to protect the impressions, then tucked it inside the legal documents. He placed everything back into the now sacred steel box. He closed the lid. It settled with a muted thud. He inserted the bronze key, twisted it until the mechanism engaged with a satisfying, stiff key chunk, and then withdrew the key. The box was secured. He held the box tightly. He could not leave it here. If the lawyers or creditors were already monitoring the house, they might be preparing to move in September. He needed to be mobile, yet secure. Elias needed a hiding place that was not merely concealed, but functionally impenetrable. A final defensive layer against the outside world. He stood up, the stiffness in his knees protesting the sudden movement. He looked beyond the study, towards the depths of Blackwood Manor, the parts he had not yet fully cleaned, The room still consumed by layers of undisturbed grime and darkness. The house was his inheritance, his responsibility, and now his enemy. He had 3 months to continue his meticulous work, to ensure his demonstrable act of stewardship was undeniable, and to prepare for the inevitable confrontation that would follow the expiration of the trust. He needed to continue cleaning. He needed to make the manor habitable, but first he needed to find the one place where his most precious, critical documents, the proof of his name and right, would remain untouched and secret until the deadline arrived. He extinguished 2 of the candles, keeping only one, held in a heavy brass holder he had found on the study desk. The small flame cast a single, struggling beam forward as Elias Vance, the unlikely heir, turned his back on the study and walked deeper into the chilling, vast silence of Blackwood Manor. The heavy steel box clutched tightly against his vulnerable chest. His fight for sanctuary had just become a fight for survival.